New Zealand has a legacy of deadly disasters.
I knew my brother and my father were dead. I just knew.
Disasters that have shaped our country.
A catastrophic earthquake hit Hawke's Bay.
A deadly influenza virus swept throughout the world.
The SS Wairarapa slammed straight into the northern tip of Great Barrier Island.
6 celebrated New Zealanders retrace some of this country's darkest days, bringing history alive through the eyes of descendants.
I could hear people screaming and crying and yelling. The stench was so you could smell death.
It was my Uncle Kevin. He said there's been an explosion in the mine.
The vast oceans around New Zealand can be a violent and unpredictable.
Sailing our coastline.
I've circumnavigated New Zealand.
I survived both my big voyages, but others haven't been so lucky.
Our coastlines have claimed thousands of ships over the years, but the wreck of the SS Wairarapa was one of the worst, with the loss of around 130 lives.
So these days, this is all that's left of the Wairarapa. It's essentially a graveyard.
The SS Wairarapa left Sydney crossing the town routine, but for the roughly 235 passengers and crew, this voyage would become a terrifying ordeal. Amongst the passengers was Felix West and his family, who were immigrating to New Zealand from England. Also on board were Mariano Vella and his new wife Elizabeth. After being married in Europe, they were also heading to New Zealand to begin their new life together. Charlotte MacDonald. And after the tragic death of her husband. Just a few weeks earlier, the Wairarapas experienced an Last and first was very important in the competitive and cutthroat business of sea travel. The captain made good time across the Tasman, but struck heavy fog as he neared New Zealand.
They rounded and a building seat. They came down and were pushed.
As night fell, some of the passengers and crew became worried about the ship's speed, the fog, and the captain's strange behaviour.
To slow down or at least sound the foghorn, but McIntosh refused. Just after midnight on a tip of Great Barrier Island, it was one of the worst disasters in New Zealand history. Smacked into these cliffs right there. Water immediately and listed onto its port side.
Desperate battle for their lives.
There were huge seas washing over the deck, and 60 people managed to climb up into the rigging on the masts and stay there until it got.
How to reach the shore.
As dawn broke, there was still a big swell washing all around the rocks here. and second engineer James Dunn, he volunteered to swim a rope ashore.
But in the heavy sea, he just managed to clamber onto the rocks himself. It was then the first person on the rope was Sarah Williams, who was travelling with her sister Jane. A passenger, Mrs. Mary Ferguson, described the awful scenes in her diary.
Pulled back through the water again to the time she got out of the at our feet.
Mrs. Ferguson asked a steward to help revive her.
But I shall never forget the awful, hopeless look in the man's eyes as he said to me, "It is perhaps kindest to leave her at peace." So there, for the first time, I realised how hopeless we might be there for weeks before we were found and perish miserably. What a shocker of a...
An 11-year-old boy travelling with his mother, father and 2 brothers.
Disaster. There was nothing to indicate disaster for the first few days, but on the 28th, fog came to safeguard the course of a vessel. I, like many others, had premonitions of trouble. 12 knots. The result of this trend to the east was that the ship ran on rocks at Miner's Head on the northwest tip of the Great Barrier.
The ship took an immediate list to port, and it was difficult to climb up the sloping deck to keep clear of the water, which was rising and growing in roughness with the tide. Golly. And he was only 11.
Come out from England, and that's his younger brother Basil, his older brother Stanley.
In some panic, Felix was separated from his family.
I was invited by a group of men.
They sort of set up. Then down. So it would have been some.
To land, aren't they?
That's right. I mean, and yet so close and yet so far away. Is what was.
On his back along the outside edge of the deck and also guided me on the rope.
That's this here. So from the davits halfway down the vessel where they were staying, you know, during the dark hours, the rope was attached from the bow across to the rocks.
Swung over to the island. Yeah. Means of salvation.
Okay, so here's Felix. He's survived, and no one else in his family has.
No.
Totally alone.
I know.
As far as he's concerned. They're all whipped away.
I don't know if there were any tears from him, or whether he cried alone, or whether he cried with anybody, or...
Terrible.
What makes him unique was that he was very young. He was the youngest survivor, but old enough to remember.
Disaster, and his correspondence with another survivor clearly points the sank in 1894, leaving him completely alone.
What happened to him then?
Well, as far as took him in, and he was organised a few months later to go to Wanganui Collegiate, where he boarded. I was launched on a further sea of troubled waters, and with it, life at the Wanganui Collegiate School boarding establishment.
Oh dear. So what was Felix actually like?
The Felix that I met, he was fairly introverted. I felt there's not a lot of emotion. Parents seemed to sleep in separate rooms. It was a strange situation. My grandmother, but he would be happy on his own little, he had his own little area within the lounge.
Getting involved with...
It's clear the disaster had a huge effect on Felix's life. Felix
She met a barmaid some years afterwards who said he had to be helped on board in a drunken condition. The barmaid gave him the impression that it was always thought that alcohol was one of the causes for the shipwreck, and that's why there was not a drop of alcohol in that house.
So who was Elizabeth Vella, and how did Felix?
Mariano Vella was a Dalmatian sailor who immigrated to New Zealand in the 1870s and ended up farming out there on Mana Island.
Leaving him with and a farm to run. So he new bride when they were shipwrecked on the Wairarapa.
Okay, so Elizabeth, who was Mariano?
Well, he was my grandfather. When they came over from Europe, I think they changed ships at Australia.
Elizabeth Vella's account of the shipwreck was well documented, and an audio recording she made almost 60 years ago is still a treasured family heirloom.
Can you remember very vividly your arrival in New Zealand?
I'll never forget. I was sound asleep, and my husband, he said, "Hurry up." And I said, "What for?" He said, "Hurry up."
In the confusion, Mariano and Elizabeth made it up onto the deck and into a lifeboat.
But I was in a dock. And we went in the water.
Mariano and Elizabeth were fighting for their lives, but in the cold, surging sea they became separated. Luckily, Elizabeth managed to grab a piece of wreckage to keep herself afloat.
My husband says, "Stay there, not move until I find you." All right.
Together, they clung to the piece of wreckage. In the morning, cold and wet, they eventually made it to shore.
Uh, 22. Honeymoon.
Honeymoon, wasn't it?
Yes, very nice one.
So that was a honeymoon. I mean, and she'd only really just
And that's Grandma and Grandpa there.
she's a
Despite the disastrous start to their marriage, Mariano and Elizabeth went on to lead a prosperous life. And their house is still in the family, 5 generations later.
I've lived here from when I was 13. I came with Mum and Dad, and then we bought it from them in 19... My
So what do you recall of Elizabeth actually living here?
thing I remember about her is sitting in a rocking chair and being very dark and spooky. So I was...
Mariano's boat shed. Was a vital part of...
So before they had VHF radios and cell phones, how did they communicate?
A lot of it was done with... and indicate with those sort of things. So he'd have somebody here on shore, normally Elizabeth, and he'd be over there and he'd signal that he's all okay and coming back.
And it was probably this resourcefulness that saved Mariano and Elizabeth on the night of the shipwreck.
Then he shipwrecks her, they lose all their trousseau and everything that they've got, and thinking,
Mariano and Elizabeth
As it turns out, Mariano was our great-granddad, and he survived with his second wife, Elizabeth, and I was descended from Mariano and his first wife.
Brian's now living as close as from where the Wairarapa sank.
The other family connection is with my second wife, Billy, and she has connections to the old people who looked after the survivors. And if you read Elizabeth's survival account and how afraid they were of the natives and all the tattoos and mokos and things and where they're going to get eaten, you can get a perspective of what it was like for them.
Sailed these waters for years. Brian well.
So what's the sort of Great Barrier?
Bowden. You'll get large ocean swells curling around the top end of the Needles and barreling all the way.
These cliffs look evil. What a place to run into. It's outrageous. Look at that. You couldn't get a more inhospitable anywhere, but least of all here.
So how did the Wairarapa, once the pride of the Union Steamship Company, fled? When the SS Wairarapa sank on Great Barrier These days, Port Chalmers is a totally different place, but the maritime history is still here, almost everywhere you look.
Okay, well, the SS Wairarapa, here it is here. This is massive. Just a huge responsibility. Ornate, you know, it's not like sort of Cook Strait ferries these days. This is really very finely finished. You've got a lot of wonderful joinery, cabinet makers, skylights, you've got the upholstery, it looks like carpets. Mackintosh, Captain Mackintosh, had a whole which is what makes the rumours of him being drunk.
There's also a certain irony that it was a publican, Mr. in the fog.
Day, quote. And the second one took his life.
George Chick's a pretty interesting character, really. He was a pillar of society and even served a couple of terms on the local borough council.
In the day, it was legendary for having the cheapest booze and the nastiest slags this side of the Pacific.
But Chick's Hotel was notorious for other reasons. One story has it that the cellar of the hotel was used to Shanghaiing involved and forcing them to sea.
We'll never know whether it's true or not, whether it's an urban legend or a Chick's Hotel legend. Who knows, but it's quite possible.
George Chick's body was one of dozens that was never recovered from the Wairarapa. So he wasn't buried in his family plot here in Port Chalmers. But just down the road, there's a monument with
Well, Lizzie Grinrod and McDonald, they're just names on this. But they paid the ultimate price in the wreck of the Wairarapa, and the story of Charlotte McDonald was particularly.
Charlotte McDonald was a stewardess and was asleep when the ship struck. Dressed in the passengers ahead of her own. She even gave her own lifebelt away. Without it, she later drowned. Charlotte McDonald worked and in the end lost her life at sea. And it turns out that working at sea is something that's run in her family ever since. His job? To get pilots safely on and off the ships coming into port.
Yes, yes.
And you're driving. So what about, does it run in the family? Like, yeah, it's a...
I think so, all the way through. Is all my forefathers were all seamen.
Okay, thank you. And two pilots. And if you can make a good lee on the starboard side. Good lee on the starboard side, thank you.
I don't usually want to... But Jim's got us all sorted though. Always admired pilot boats, and also that moment of truth when the pilots actually get from this boat onto the big ship. Well, it's a precarious moment boarding something that's as huge as a ship.
Although Jim's been working the Otago Harbour for a good chunk of his life, he doesn't know a lot about Charlotte MacDonald, who sailed the same stretch of water almost 120 years ago.
Charlotte, a bit of a mystery to ourselves. Coming from Dundee, and what happened to her here, we that's the only history.
Charlotte's name in here?
Yeah, that's Charlotte there, Charlotte Octoloni. Yeah, that's her maiden name. Yeah. She was become a MacDonald.
And the best place to find it is back at the local museum in Port Chalmers.
Tell us about Charlotte MacDonald.
Andrew, this is her. And she married Alexander MacDonald, a seaman, here in Port Chalmers in 1880. And then he was serving on aboard up. And she also was looking after her aged mother.
No, you had. Yeah, that's totally news to me at all.
Yeah,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it makes you feel.
After the death of her husband, Charlotte had to support her 4 children. And the obvious choice was a Union steamer.
She went to sea as a stewardess, and then she obviously did well because she was the chief stewardess on the Wairarapa.
But for her children, her death must have been a terrible loss.
The mother's body was never recovered, so this is all they would have had, the 4 orphaned children, to remember her by. And they would have probably come here and stood around when it was brand new and set up. Yeah, terrible.
At the inquiry into the shipwreck, the magistrate said the stewardesses preferred death to neglect or dishonour. The conduct of these noble, self-sacrificing women is beyond human praise. But I wonder if her employer acted quite as honourably. Pouring of public sympathy for the victims. But behind the closed doors of the Union Steamship Company's head office,
here on November 6th, it appears that the company are consulting their lawyers to see how their liability stands. Opinion of Smith, Chapman, Sinclair, White that the clauses on passengers' tickets absolved the company from liability for loss of and all the way through here, people's claims are being denied. It just seems so cold-hearted, it's outrageous.
whose sister Sarah drowned while trying to make it ashore on the rope.
Letter from Auckland manager and they've declined that one as well. It seems incredibly hard-hearted of the company just to reply.
Also looks like the company was looking for a scapegoat.
There's a suggestion that Captain McIntosh of intellect as the result. So what's an aberration of intellect? Obviously crazy. They're clearly trying to put the blame on the captain.
Captain McIntosh may have been sick, but I think he was also under enormous pressure. Hutter Parker had entered the Trans-Tasman market. All through these company minutes, there are references to Hutter Parker, and there's no doubt the Union Steamship Company were concerned about their new rival. But why was it so important for the Union Company to maintain its monopoly?
The Union Company was formed in Dunedin in 1875. OK, Dunedin's a small city nowadays. It was the biggest city in the country for 20 years, from the 1860s to the mid-1880s. So it was natural, if you're setting up a shipping line, that was the place to go.
If you put it into a modern context, how big, by comparison today, would it be to who?
Oh, at its peak, if you add Air New Zealand, Kiwi Rail and Mainfreight, you've got it. It was an enormous enterprise. It was our first multinational company.
And clearly the Union Steamship Company didn't take too kindly to Hutter Parker threatening their monopoly. Competition between the two companies even led to ships racing each other.
There's a lovely photograph of the Warramoo belting into Lyttelton entrance there, smoke everywhere. The Rotomahana. Obviously a race. The masters at the time would deny that it was a race. They would say they were making schedule.
It was an ominous coincidence, but Tulloch, the Wairarapa's fourth officer. There's no doubt the captain played a big... Some of his crew did perform admirably in the circumstances.
So this is Walter Tulloch?
This is Walter Tulloch, yes.
How old were you, John, when you...
Be 4 years old. Of a rather austere man, very nattily. Gold chain, always very, very neat.
Did he talk to you about the wreck?
Yes. Walter was off duty. He was actually in his cabin. He shared it with the third officer, Mr. Johnson. And he was lying on his back. And he realised something major had happened, and he came out to the companionway, and he came straight out onto the deck to his lifeboat, which was number 5, and he had that ready.
So there's a picture here of one of the lifeboats, and they're big beasts, aren't they? They're heavy.
Are heavy. When it was launched, it had only about 8 or 9 people in it. He picked up as many people out of the water as he could, so he ended up with 29 people in a boat that was only supposed to carry about 12. Accident.
So did Walter ever actually express?
No, he said there was a lot of shouting and he never ever really showed any emotion. 16 horses on board as deck cargo, and they went over the side. And of course they couldn't land anywhere because of the cliffs.
And they were in the water with the people?
They were in the water with the people kicking, and
In the chaos, the captain was seen diving from the bridge, and he was never seen again.
the Union Company rule. Drunk as a skunk. He had suffered from the flu, and the only cure for flu in those days was whiskey. Everybody said the captain was drunk. To his knowledge, taken any alcohol. Yeah.
Whether Captain McIntosh was drunk or not, what mattered now was the lives of the 29 survivors aboard the 4th Officer's lifeboat. When the Wairarapa sank off Great Barrier Island in 1894, the 4th Officer Walter Tulloch quickly launched his life. They stayed near the wreck until dawn, but with nowhere to come ashore safely, they rowed north.
Look at this place. So this is where he got to, is it?
This is where he landed, yeah. Gosh.
Yeah, here's a chart. Okay. So where was it, John?
The wreck was right
in there.
And they drifted around here for a few hours, then they went right. It's all cliffs all the way down, right back down here, round here, and back in onto the beach at the stream.
And this was landing?
Yes.
On this east coast?
On this east coast. Miles.
That's a killer row.
And he always understated things.
With 29 people on an overloaded lifeboat without... Have you ever been here before, John?
I've never been here before, no. I think this is paradise.
Settlers at Whangapoa Beach who no doubt helped the 60-odd survivors from the lifeboats. But Walter didn't stop.
Duty was to get the people to Auckland, or the survivors to Auckland.
Right, so it's not over yet?
It's not over yet, no. Mr. Tulloch and the chief engineer walked across to get help and left the rest of the crew and the passengers there.
Okay, and that's 3 miles straight line.
3 miles in a straight line.
But that could turn into 6 miles, really, couldn't it?
Easily.
Fitzroy, where the Walter finally made it back to Auckland himself, where he immediately sent a telegram to his father in Port Chalmers.
It says, been wrecked, barrier, quite well, lost everything. Signed, W. Tulloch. We were told that this was the first telegram sent regarding the wreck to Port Chalmers. Before that, the shipping company didn't know anything about it.
So this was the first, the actual company of the...
Would have, yeah.
So being here now, John, do you feel the sort of the history of the place, of his episode here?
It's absolutely huge. No, I do feel that the enormity of it all and the sense of history with it, how great it was, or how great the situation was. You can picture white and just hitting the shore and then sorting themselves out.
The chief engineer, the 3rd officer, and Walter Tulloch, the 4th officer, walked right across the island to here, Catherine Bay. The local iwi had several settlements in the area at the time, and they dispatched 3 boats up to the wreck site to look for survivors.
The death toll would have been much higher. Survivors like Mrs. Ferguson them.
A joyful shout went up that a boat was coming, manned by Maori. It was a splendid thing for the Maori to do. Then we were soon off with a boat full of women and Felix years old. We were taken some distance and landed in a nice made a fire and gave us some tea without milk or sugar and cooked some sweet potatoes. The other survivors were there who had got away in boats, so we were quite a large party. All the Maori were so very kind, and it all happened right here.
At the time, Great Barrier was a remote and sparsely settlers, all survivors. In fact, descendants of some of the original European settlers still live on the island and keep the history of the Wairarapa alive.
The first Flynn on the island was my great-grandfather, 1859.
Opening their homes,
There, virtually on the morning of the wreck, and did what they could, of course, see. And went out, yeah, with you know, the virtually covered in wreckage. It would have been chaos, yeah.
So what's the teapot all about?
The teapot was presented to the family by the Union Steamship Company. It was inscribed with a inscription that it just said, presented to the Flynn family for services at wreck. Yeah, for something that was used for about 50 years afterwards on the old coal range there. This photograph was taken at the and they've got the Wairarapa lifebelt up.
Over the years, other artefacts from the shipwreck have found their way back to the island and are now displayed. Barrier are the grave sites. As well as the gruesome task of recovering the bodies, the local iwi also provided land to bury the...
This is the land that the iwi provided and designated for the burial sites, and it shall remain so. Under the surf and the wind and the trees eternally. This is quite a nice... As someone who likes being on the sea, I've learned to respect its power. And how dangerous it is. But when it comes to the Wairarapa and Captain McIntosh, sight of that, Captain McIntosh's behaviour that night on the bridge, well, it was bizarre behaviour to be going that fast in those conditions. And it resulted in this. Talking to descendants, I've really started to appreciate the generations as well.
Now when I head back out to sea, I'm going to take a whole new level of caution and respect for our coastline and the dangers it presents.